Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Jillian Medoff in support of When We Were Bright and Beautiful and in conversation this evening with Lacey Crawford. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed this evening, but I encourage you to keep that chat window open. I'll be sharing links to purchase the book from Literati throughout the event. The Q&A is available to you, however, and I encourage you to submit your questions for Jillian. Whenever the spirit moves you to do so, please feel free to enter a question into the question box. I'll read a selection of your questions at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me, or you can also click on the little typewriter icon on the screen to subscribe to our channel and be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events once they become available there. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, of course, our doors are open for in-store shopping. But most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening, or this afternoon, or this morning, or much later this evening, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us from. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Jillian Medoff is the author of the national bestseller I Couldn't Love You More, as well as the novels Good Girls Gone Bad and Hunger Point, a former fellow at McDowell, Blue Mountain Center, VCCA, and Fundación Valparaiso. She is an MFA from NYU. In addition to writing fiction, Jillian has a long career in management consulting and is currently senior consultant at the Siegel Group, where she advises clients on all aspects of the employee experience. Joining her this evening, Lacey Crawford is the author of fiction and nonfiction, including the satire Early Decision and the memoir Notes on a Silencing. Notes on a Silencing was named a New York Times Editor's Choice and Notable Book, as well as the Best Book of 2020 by Time, People, NPR, Bookpage, Library Journal, and LitHub. Lacey's work has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Narrative, LitHub, and Vanity Fair. She lives in California. Please join me in welcoming Jillian Medoff and Lacey Crawford into your living rooms.
Thank you, John. Hi, Jillian.
Hi, Lacey. Thank you so much for doing this. And thank you to Literati. Thank you. It's been a big week.
It has.
Yes. Yes.
Did you want to read a few pages, or should we dive right in?
Let's just dive right in.
Okay. So, I have spent a long time thinking about how to talk about this book, but protect the spoilers. It is a book that is about a lie that's built on a lie or based on a lie, right? And there's this fulcrum at the center, and we're not sure until the end which one of these narratives is going to come to the fore and be authentic and which one won't. So we're going to have to be a little bit cryptic at times talking about this, because I want to protect that revelation for people who haven't read it yet. I did not see it coming, and I should have, for all sorts of reasons. Part of it is I was just reading so fast that I wasn't bothering to guess. But I wondered if we could, protecting what we don't want to reveal, if you could just give us a brief overview of the basic plot, and then we can go from there.
Well, When We Were Bright and Beautiful is about a family, a very uber wealthy family, and they live on the Upper East Side. And it opens the very first paragraph. A 23-year-old girl, her brother calls and says something awful happened to Billy, who is their brother. And it turns out he's been accused of sexually assaulting his former girlfriend. So the narrative moves forward over the course of the year that takes place, where we go through all of the steps toward trial. And you understand, I think it's pretty obvious that from the start that there are a couple of stories being told. Ultimately, Cassie is telling you about a crime, the crime that her brother did not commit, and the family is very united in supporting him. But the book is actually about two crimes. And so you find out over the course of the book there are different reveals at different times where you start to question all the content that came before, so that by the end of the book, it's a whole experience, and you realize the book that you have that you're reading at the end is not the same book that you started. So I was very interested in dealing with narrative and voice and telling stories. And I think ultimately, after many years, it came together. But you have to get to the end to understand really what the whole project is about.
So as a writer, I'm fascinated by how you made this architecture work. And I really want to ask a lot of questions related to that because it's a puzzle box and it all fits. And there is trauma at its core, but the trauma is not held in an overt or expository mode, which is refreshing, actually. I mean, because of the subject of my memoir and the experience of the last several years of my life, I have been really engaged with these issues in all ways. I wasn't sure that a fictionalized treatment would work for me, but there is an authenticity at the heart of the book that resonated completely with my experience and with that of a lot of people I know, women and men. So I wanted to know first, Cassie, who's 23, tells us the story, and she tells it in first person. So we are really limited by what it is that she's willing to share. Though, of course, there's the discourse, in the background, right? And all of Me Too. I wonder if you could tell us what came to you first. What did you first know about what this book would become, and how did you then map this out?
Sure. Well, first, I also want to tell you that I have been following your career since your novel. And I love Notes on Asylum. I loved it. I read it several times, largely to see how it was put together, because in the last few years, I've been really studying nonfiction to understand how to deal with years of data and information and tell it in a way that's engaging and keeps you turning pages. So I just loved your book. And in fact, when we were going through the list of people to ask for endorsements, and I was like, oh, I don't know. She wouldn't do it. I don't know. I was so hesitant to ask you. But when you agreed to do this, I was so thrilled. And I was even telling my husband tonight, we were having dinner, and I said, I'm going to be with, we were talking about Lacy Crawford, and I talked about your book, and he's like, oh my God, I know that story. And I'm like, oh, great. She's amazing. She's amazing. No, I mean, you are just, I think you're just wonderful. Well, I am a fiction writer. That's all I do is adult, fiction. And I say that only because in the early parts of my career, I had opportunities to veer into young adult, and I only, because I have a job, I just do one type of project. That's it, adult fiction. And this book started really with the luxury building. And the Belmont is sort of like a Dakota, but even more exclusive because it's smaller and older. And I first envisioned this as being a contemporary upstairs, downstairs. And I knew it was going to kick off with a crime. And I thought it would be sort of like Bonfire of the Vanities. And the reason I'm using these books as examples is just because anything else I use will possibly give something away about the story itself. So it's easier to talk about it as comparing it to other types of novels. And the thing about my original idea was I was really interested in class and parenting. And so originally the book started with an image, which is really how I'd start novels. I'll start with a sliver of dialogue or an image, and then I'll just follow the story where it goes. Like I never, ever, ever use outlines. And sometimes I'll know what the ending might be, but I don't know how I'll get there. And so originally in this story, a 6-year-old girl is in a town car, and she's the doorman is watching her as she's being ferried off to school. And she raises her hand, and he thinks she's waving goodbye. But then later in the day, it occurs to him that she was signaling for help. And so that kicks off the story where her mother, who was an heiress, was ultimately charged with neglect. And the reason that book couldn't really sustain that, it wasn't interesting enough for me to sustain an entire 5 or 6 years of interest, because a book will take me between 4 and 7 years. But I also felt like trying to deal with the upstairs relationships and the downstairs relationships was overwhelming. So I just winnowed it down to one family. But the main character, Cassie, she went from 6 years old to 23. Mm-hmm. And her mother is still her mother. But I really focused on this family. And as I got to know them, I delved deeper into their relationships. And the way that I write is to move forward and to go back, and then to move forward and to go back. So it's exhausting. It takes many years before I'll even know what this novel's about. But then it clicked, I guess about year 2 or 3. And that's when I started using outlines and realizing, okay, you know what? I'm going to have to plot this because the structure is going to be unwieldy, and if I don't. And that's how I figured out where I wanted the reveals to be. But they came to me as I was doing it. So then I would still have to go back anyway and replot it going forward. But, so a couple of people from the original book survived, like the doorman is the same doorman. And so I have a really good idea of who these people are because I lived with them for so long.
So I wanted to ask, I felt a little bit incriminated in parts of this book. I certainly did not grow up with the kind of enormous wealth that you depict in the Quinn family. I think they scoff at one point at being accused of having, what is it, like 700 million, and they say, it's only like 300 or something like that. Right? But there's dynastic wealth on both sides, right, or at least on the mother's side, and there is evidence of the sort of dissipation in the young people because they don't actually have to finish college in order to have a job, working right in private wealth management, or whatever it is. And the father and the son both went to Groton. My brother was at Groton for a few years. So I was curious about the choice to, especially now, try to humanize, generate reader sympathy for a family whose wealth cushions them so in such an extraordinary way. And I would love to hear you describe. It's the kind of thing that I, as a writer, if I were trying my hand at fiction again, would be like, ugh, I am not touching that. Right. I just I can't go there, right, and there are a bunch of reasons why, right? But you did, and you really did. And Cassie is in the lap of that and also has her own, income coming to her. So it keeps her safe from some things, even as she's exquisitely vulnerable to other things. So how did you go hang out up on Park Avenue around buildings like this? Were you like 740, like 830, like how, it's a New York City story, right? How did you do that?
I have always been fascinated. Even from when I was a kid, by closed communities, and especially if they're very alpha. So, football teams, sororities, prisons, anything that has like Wall Street, where there's their own inner logic, their own code, their own language, their own inside jokes. I just eat that up. And so I have always been fascinated by the wealthy, more from just a gawking kind of perspective. But also because I knew that there were things that I wanted to start thinking about in terms of where I was in my own career. And one of the things that really struck me about this book is the fact that, I said this before, that I usually live with these characters for a very long time. And so it had to be a project that I was interested in enough that I would want to stay with it. And so to me, to write a story about sexual assault, I started the book in 2014 and then did the kidnapping thing for a while. And then by 2017, 2018, Me Too just exploded. And at that point, I was going to really just kind of ditch the project because I was like, I didn't want to, I knew that there was going to be a lot of books coming out, and rightly so. I mean, and I'm talking mostly fiction, but I also knew that it was going to take me another 2 years, even just to finish it. So the likelihood of my book having any unique aspects of it, I really wrestled with that. Like, did I want to just produce another story that might have already been told 2 years ago? And the one thing I did know is that it was my 5th book. And so I took it on as a challenge, not so much to say, can I humanize these people, but more, well, that was part of it, but also, can I tell a story, a unique story in a unique way? That's a challenge for me to figure out. Like, I had never really worked with big reveals before. And I found it as a novelist. I mean, it's kind of like a high wire act because I'm used to much more quiet literary fiction where, like a plot twist is someone getting really angry. You know what I mean? But when you start to move into these propulsive type narratives, it's a whole different way of thinking and writing. And I was fascinated by that. But I also knew that going into this book, like by the time I figured out what it was, I knew that the bigger challenge would be, I'm starting out in like behind the 8 ball, right? I mean, you start out saying, oh, something awful happened to Billy, which is like in this culture to say something awful happened to a potential rapist is like, are you kidding? Like, you can't do that. But I also felt like, what if this woman's story needed to be told for other reasons? And that was what really hooked me. And then I was like, well, I think a lot of people like reading about the rich and the wealthy. And there's, the internet has made life so aspirational, and what I did for research was really just these deep dives into luxury watch websites, and luxury cars and just really understanding what it looks like on the outside, and then reading everything I could get my hands on of what it's actually like on the inside. I really just binged on a lot of books about like robber barons and like JP Morgan and what his, their lives are so in many ways very sad, I think, especially as you get into generations, where the money has sort of been, diluted, and there is something to be said for having a purpose. And I think one of the things that I really talk about in the book is the idea of you might not need a job, but you do have to have a life. And I'm not expecting to garner, get people to have sympathy for these people, but I do want to show that a closed culture is just as stifling in some ways as any other. I mean, you might have more choices, but if you don't know you have choices, if you don't understand what those choices are, then you can be just as, feel just as trapped. And I think that was the point of this family, that I wanted to show just how claustrophobic it could be, especially, when Billy can't leave the house because he's got an ankle bracelet, and they're all in this just amazing mansion where they have all the room that they could just spread out. And Cassie's like, it's like, I can't find any place to put myself, because it's just so, there's just so much, she feels so inundated just by the family and the responsibilities of what it means to be a Quinn.
And she is, of course, an outsider.
She is an outsider.
That's not a spoiler. So she was
No.
adopted by these parents when she was very young, after both of her parents died. So,
Right.
Though she has her own wealth, right? So she is an outsider, but an outsider with an inside line to this world. I mean, I was really interested in how, there was the wealth thing that would have been really scary for me writing it if these were the characters who came to me. But then also, of course, Me Too. And I understand completely, because I was writing my memoir from 2017 to the beginning of 2018. And for me, I felt just pummeled by the fact that we were hearing all of these stories, which was a moment of solidarity that was, how many thousands of years in the making, frankly, before enough women are able to, to follow Tarana Burke's suggestion that perhaps there's safety in numbers or, change in numbers. At the same time, I had just found out that the state investigation into my boarding school would not be including my case and wanted nothing from my file, even though there was documented felonious statutory assault and a cover-up. And so it was a remarkable moment when I was actually asked to keep quiet about that, because other people were still coming forward for this investigation, and the detectives didn't want other victims to feel that the investigation had been compromised in some way. So I remember telling my husband, I'm like literally the only woman on earth who's been asked to zip it right now. Everyone else is like, me too, speak up, I'll amplify, I'll hold you, and what you did with this in fiction, in craft, is Me Too. I hate that, is reductive to me, but it does the job. Me Too, the title, becomes a character effectively in the book. And the way I saw this working at first, and I just thought, oh God, that's so clever. Like you have to have written a lot to know how to make that a tool to say, okay, we're going to do this. In the beginning, Billy, who is a junior at Princeton, he runs track. He is both the perfect golden boy and also the perfect villain, sort of at the same time. Cassie adores him, and the ex-girlfriend who has brought the allegations is depicted as, hysterical and crazy and a compulsive liar and all of these things that we've all been called when we've said what happened. And I wasn't sure actually who I believed. I absolutely could have gone with Cassie because she seemed pretty smart and aware, and at the same time, I mean, there's even a line where I think it's Nate who says, the oldest brother, who says of Billy, "You've got a story everyone knows." So that's what you were writing into, is that everyone who picks up this book is like, oh, I know this story. I know exactly this story. And no, actually, we don't. Right. And later during the trial, and I hope you'll tell us how you arrived at writing that whole section, which is procedural and terrifying and awesome, and also has an upstairs downstairs component with the character of Peter Di Fiore, who's the sort of the lawyer they hire, who is not of their kind, right? But the Quinns can't go anywhere because they're mobbed, right? I mean, it's not just Billy not being able to run because of an ankle bracelet, but everywhere they go, there are headlines screaming, and there are crowds on every street corner, and there are people protesting. So Me Too functions to actually double down on the insularity and the expectation of loyalty within their family. And that makes Cassie's situation even worse, right? And I thought, God, I know that. Actually, I know that. Like, Me Too can actually make something harder. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. I mean, I think these are, first of all, I thank you. You totally get the book. Like, you get that it's multi-layered, and that I did want to just jump into the fact that it seems like a lot of cultural moments have cycles. And, this reached a crescendo where, suddenly you were hearing men feeling like, I can't say anything. I can't do anything. I'm going to get, and it's like, that's not really how it works. But I was fascinated by the victim like suddenly they're the victims. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna start from that premise. And I knew that there were going to be a lot of challenges, especially when, you're at some point, and I didn't really think this through actively early on, but at some point you have to sell the book. And it is, people do pick it up and say, I know the story. I know exactly what happens. And I'm like, well, no, you don't. So just stick with me. But I think the idea of what we hear and what we think, and as we read, is how your whole assumptions can be overturned by just, a moment. I'm fascinated by that, about how, for a while, I wasn't sure about Billy either.
Okay.
And it took me a couple of years really to figure out the ending and what I really knew to be true. And then of course I had to start over and go back, and then because you have to seed it early. But I do agree with you 100% that there are times where something huge like Me Too it can be used as a shorthand in a negative way. And I wanted to explore what happens where we go into a story thinking we already know how it's going to be, especially from a woman telling a story about another woman,
Right, which I, coming in, wanted to go with my narrator. And even when I wanted to go against her, I didn't necessarily have enough data to do so. I mean, I think one of the things that I really appreciated about your depiction of Billy is that, I've come across this with people who have disclosed to me and their families all the time, but it is excruciating that sometimes, most of the time, people who commit sexual and gendered violence offenses are wonderful to a lot of other people in their lives. I mean, it's not like a rapist rapes everyone he sees, right? It doesn't work that way, right? So there is, in fact, a community that loves someone and knows that person, but doesn't know the part of this person that, for whatever instinct, reason, predatory, whatever, on that day did this thing, and how putting together those behaviors is really impossible for some families and some communities to do. And it's much, much easier to just refuse entirely the person who's bringing the allegations. So you really sit in that space for a long time, and you sit in that space by giving us a sister who loves him. I mean, I know women whose brothers, have been brought up on charges like this, and it is utterly devastating because they adore these men, right? But they also believe in justice. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you built Diana Hawley, who is the ex-girlfriend who is slandered, but also perjures herself just a little bit, but also is the messenger of a greater truth, sort of almost at an allegorical level.
Right. So, the thing about Diana Hawley is that she ran the risk of being a cipher. I mean, she's the kind of character that, because you're only getting her through one perspective, and that's a very biased perspective, she could have so easily have been not really like 360 degrees or not fully fleshed out. But once I knew the setup and what was happening, she became 100% real to me. And the way that characters really become real is when they start speaking. And so what I tend to do a lot is I'll write many, many scenes from a different person's point of view, and then never use them. But it allows me to see that person walking into a room and then getting the perspective from a whole other, like a supporting character. And I think when I was younger, I didn't really understand, when I was a younger writer, I didn't really understand that secondary characters have to live on the page the same way your primary characters do. And it's only over time and reading lots of books that you understand how books are put together and what it means to have secondary and tertiary characters. Like, everybody deserves their SAG card, right? Everybody deserves to have lines and be on stage. If you're going to put them in the book, they have to have a purpose. And, Diana was weird. It was weird. She was hard to write because she starts out as a complete adversary. And over the course of the book, what you're seeing is Cassie coming to some terms of not just her perceptions of Diana at the trial, but also her perceptions of having met Diana before. Because she, in wanting to support her brother, she filled in a lot of, she did a lot of mental, filling in all the gaps of the story of what she didn't know. And I think that's what is very true about just about living and about memory, is that, you can know certain things on an instinctive level, but that doesn't mean that you can know them on an explicit level or acknowledge them. And over the course of the book, what I was trying to work with really was like, consciousness and how you come into an understanding, not just of other people, but also of yourself. And, not every unreliable narrator knows that they're unreliable, or they might be unreliable, but not in the way that they think they are. And as the novelist, like, I'm the one pulling the strings, so I have to know a lot more. But that in and of itself, for me, came with, 30 years and 5 books. It takes a long time to get to a level where I understand that the book is working on different dimensions. I mean, it's taken me this long to write this book.
I'm really glad you said that about unreliable narrator, because I think at some point I came across, some marketing copy or something that described an unreliable narrator. I don't think Cassie is an unreliable narrator, at least not in the classical sense of that device, because I saw her, and maybe I filled in the gaps, but I saw her first as withholding or providing information that she believed without perhaps interrogating things she might have interrogated. We all do that, right? Mm-hmm. And then realizing in real time what it was that she had always known, but as you say, could not speak to, wasn't right. An environment where she could speak those truths, right? So what was remarkable was, and again, I go back to imagining you as the writer. So once you've figured out in year 2 or year 3 or whatever in the marathon that this is the story, and this is the lie, and then there's this, right? So there are revelations that the book gives us in Cassie's voice because we need them to keep the plot humming along. And then there are revelations that Cassie arrives at as part of her character development. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like there are twin timelines. I mean, how did you build the architecture of this book? Because the trial then becomes the scene where these things unfold and the penny drops internally right. before she acts in the world. And so we see that gap where she figures it out and then, oh my God, now what happens? And that moment of dramatic tension, I mean, I was flying through the pages. And you built that. Right. So I'm asking as a writer, how did you build that?
Well, for me, I always look at a novel. It has like 3 different, sometimes 4 different timelines. So you have natural time, which is 12 months of the year, and then you have the timeline of the story in the book that happens, let's say, within those 12 months.
Sure.
And so I had to plot that. And then you also have to plot each character's, not just their actions, but where they are emotionally. Right. And so if something happens in April and then, 3 months later, you can't say, you have to understand that it's going to be hot out. Mm-hmm. There's going to be, like everything is a big puzzle. And so I do plot on multiple timelines. that was the kind of thing that I had done with my previous book, which is called This Could Hurt, and it's a workplace novel. And I use a different, a rotating cast. And I vowed never to do that again because it's so hard. But then, in fact, this book was even more challenging because it was such a granular look at knowing and non-knowing, and so like you can only move forward an inch, but within that inch, a lot can happen.
Yes.
And so I think one of the things that I know about myself is that I've always written like literary fiction, and that is just a shorthand for saying I focus really on character development, sometimes at the expense of plot. And I know that this book, the first section, there's 3 sections really. And then at the end of the first section, you get a reveal. And then at the end of the second section, you learn more. And then at the end of the third section, you learn everything you need to know to put the whole thing together. But I don't write thrillers or mysteries in the classical sense where you just shoot out of the rocket from the first page. Like everything is organically created. So lines and dialogue and images that you might see in the first 50 pages eventually show up again in the end. And I think that is, for different readers, have different reactions. It's like, some people might find the beginning a little more slow going, but that's sort of how it works in these books where if you're going to really want the biggest bang for whatever you're doing at the end, the reader has to sit with all of the different details and the interactions. Otherwise, the power of the ending falls flat. And I think that for me, one of the things, just as a point of interest as a writer, is that structure and a book's architecture is most important because I do have a job. And so if I try to get the structure first, because then I can work on all the interstitial stuff. I can work on that while I'm out at my job. You know what I mean? Like if I have 2 hours, I can work on a chapter, but I can't step back and see the whole thing, while I'm at work. It's too much.
Right. So I mean, this is kind of a technical question a little bit, but I know you do management consulting. Your clients are CEOs and very high level corporate clients. I have a bunch of consulting experience in my background, and I know a bit about those engagements and what it means to be serving clients at that level, and the way you have to really take on board all of their bullshit, like right. Everything they've got going on becomes your book. That's the book you're writing. You're sorting out, and doing a lot of this actual restructuring and like, let's figure out who these characters are and why is this not working and what secret are you not telling me, which is, keeping us all from getting where we need to go. And it's never that malevolent, right? But there's a lot of, known unknowns, right? There's a lot of stuff out there. And it cracked me up when you say, I have a job, like as though like publishing 5 novels with major houses doesn't constitute a job. And my experience of managing to produce something that makes its way into the world is that there is a gathering of momentum that feels a bit like weather coming in, and suddenly everything is about this. And then there's a sort of a cumulative level of fluency where I'm able to sit down and just produce the pages. It sounds as though, which of course requires the space to do that. So I wasn't working as a management consultant when I wrote my memoir, and my husband took our 3 young sons out every weekend, and I just went hell for leather to get these pages out. I'm really interested in how you sustain engagement for 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 years with a work when you are also having to deliver at such a high level for your clients? And that may be like too technical a question, but I have a hunch we have writers joining us or who will join us to watch this. And I'm really interested in how you keep it alive.
Well, I will be honest with you. At this point in my career, I should be running a division, or I am not as senior as 30 years in the industry would allow. In other words, I have purposely not become an officer at any company. I was with Deloitte, and then I was with Aon, and now I'm with a company called the Siegel Group. And in those big companies like Deloitte and Aon, it's up or out. So you're either you're either an officer or maybe a director, but if you're not bringing in your money, then we'll see you. But I am with a company now. I've been here for 11 years, and it's really amazing. I mean, it's a private company, and I'm a senior consultant, which means I lead client teams, but I am also, I sort of fly below the radar.
I get you.
I don't have people reporting to me. I take on projects that I can definitely manage, and I don't get ahead of myself, and at the same time, I think of the novel as anybody running a marathon. You train for it, you start out slow, it gains momentum, but I work 4 days a week, and I sometimes I work 11 months a year. So sometimes I take a month off, but that's pretty new. Or I would cobble together my vacation time. But, I have friends that publish much more frequently. For me, it's the only reason that my most recent book came out in 2018, and now it's 2022. So this is the shortest it's ever been. And that was because of the pandemic. I mean, I was really able to take advantage of not commuting to Manhattan. And I think I like a lot of landscape, and I take a lot of notes. And it's after the first few years, like the first few years of writing a book are very difficult, because I'll write the first chapter over and over and over because it feels so good to have written. But then as you move forward, it's very tedious, it's grueling. And I have a lot of tricks that, like I'll never leave a paragraph finished. I always leave it in the middle of a thought.
Yeah.
Whenever I try very hard when I finish a writing session, to go do something like exercise or something, or just walk, or just because that is when all the things that I need to think about really happen. I make things 10 times harder on myself than they have to be. Like I try to craft really great paragraphs. And that's not just like in first drafts. You just got to let a lot of shit go. I mean, my first drafts are so awful. I mean, people, it takes me 25 pages when I was first starting out, and it takes me forever just to get a guy walking out the door or sitting down on an airplane, right? It's like he lowers his tray table. Like, we know, we've all been on planes, but as the more books you write, and the more you start to trust that the reader's going to get it. And this book was particularly a challenge in that way, because there's a lot that is confusing if the reader doesn't know what's going on, and to believe, for me, the writer, to believe that the reader will stay with it, that was a leap of faith. And I took it because I understood that I knew intimately what I was writing about. I knew this in my bones. I knew what I was writing about. And it's sort of like, just trust me. Just trust that I know what I'm doing. That's me saying to the reader, and I promise you'll be rewarded. But not every reader, I mean, I think that readers have become so sophisticated in the last 15 years, or rather, because of sites like Goodreads, and they're more open and are articulate about what they are reading and why they're reading it and what they love. And it's terrific. I mean, I think it's really great. There used to be such snobbery around certain types of books, and I don't feel that. I mean, I think people are very open and honest in what they love and what they don't love, and they want to talk about books. I mean, readers are amazing. But in this case, it takes a little bit of patience. And I think if you're willing to give that, I mean, the story moves, but really the levels, they take patience to get the full picture, you know?
Well, I think I didn't experience it as slow. You didn't say slow, but I didn't experience it as needing a lot of runway at all. I trusted that you knew what you were doing. And that, aside from knowing you and your work and your colleagues and your community, I also saw that the pages were studded with moments that were freighted beyond what they needed to do. So, as a reader, we kind of detect an extra charge, in places. And some writers, if they don't know they're doing that and they don't use that then the book crumbles in your hands, right? But obviously you knew exactly why those little charges were there. And they were, for me, certain boundary violations, certain ambiguities that felt weird to me. It was a sort of spidey sense thing going on about these characters. And I also knew that if you opened with a setup as, we all know this story, right? This is one of these stories. There was absolutely no way that was going to be the story. And I couldn't figure out how you were going to it was like Cirque du Soleil. I was like, how is she going to get out of this? I don't know how she's going to get out of this. This is like, what is she going to do? Did he do it? Is the girl lying? What is the deal with the sister? What on earth is going on with the older brother and his creepy drunk friends? Like the whole thing was really fascinating to me. And then, of course, you bring in the people who, this is just an observation, but the absence of affection seems correlated with the presence of integrity among your characters in this book. And that also felt to me very, very true. Having gone through the investigation of an assault, having gone through the many layers of disclosure, producing evidence, submitting documents, all the stuff I've had to do, the people who work for the truth are not the people who put their arms around you and take you out, for a drink. In fact, be careful of anyone who does that, right?
Right.
So I was really stunned by how you pulled this off. And I know there are certain careers that are up or out. I think of a manuscript as up or out. I mean, when you go, if you decide you're going to write something, if you don't keep moving through it, it does, the muse will go on to someone else. So I think, and from what I've seen online, people are delighted, by the revelations. I know that we have like at least one question or two. I have another question I want to know how you build your villains, but maybe John, should we go to audience participation, or should I just keep blabbing?
We do have one question. I think it would be a nice lead into your question. And if you have additional questions, our viewing audience, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A. Nicole writes, who was the easiest character for you to write?
The easiest character, I think, was Nate, the big brother. And although, he was challenging in that I had to learn about his inner life, but his outward, the person that he presents himself, I've just known that guy. I feel like I've known that guy.
I know that guy.
I've met him so many times. And I was curious what was going on behind, but I did feel like I know all the trappings of this guy. I just, and then the other easier characters were the drunken friends, because, how many times we went to college, like, I know those guys. But as far as the villains, that was that was a 5-6 year process.
Building
yeah.
the villains. Yeah,
Yes.
because they are really complicated and really creepy. And nothing about it is self-evident. Nor did you revert to any of the old codes, that we use to communicate that this is the bad guy. None of that is there.
And that was, I think, how I knew that it was right.
Yeah, I get that.
Because it came to me as startling as it would come to a reader. And I'm like, okay, I didn't see that coming. And then when I did see it coming, I couldn't unsee it, and that was the project. Because I was like, you know what, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this.
So excuse me.
Okay. No.
When I went back and reread it after I figured out what there was to know, it's all there. Yeah. It's all there. And that is also the experience in real life, right? Is that this is a known unknown, and there's the shape of something, but we can't quite make it out in the dark, right? Yeah. Have readers disclosed to you yet after reading this?
What's funny is that not so much that. I did get several emails after people read the essay that I wrote about leaving my essay and leaving my agent, my former agent.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And that there are a lot of writers in the world right now. A lot of people, and I think that I am a very open person, and I'm happy to talk about things, but I don't really think about, like when I wrote that, this is the truth. I write for myself to try to figure things out on my own. And the fact that it resonates with someone else is a happy coincidence, but that's not really what I'm going for. Like I've always wrote to figure out what I need to figure out. And I feel very appreciative and very privileged and grateful to have readers, but I don't write for the world. I write for myself.
We have one more question that came in. I think we have time for one more question. Kimberly writes, you talked a bit about time and timelines in the context of your writing process. Did you write the book as it unfolds chronologically, or were some chapters actually written earlier in the process?
I write one step at a time. I'm very methodical. One follows one because I'm very interrupted all the time. It becomes too confusing for me to go back and try and figure out where I was and then go forward. So I keep myself very linear, and then sometimes I'll go after the fact and scramble it. But like, for instance, I had to write the entire, I wrote what happened between Billy and Diana exactly as it happened, step by step, even though I didn't use it in the final pages or the final draft. There's not really so much a blow by blow account. I mean, because you're getting both sides, so you see it from two perspectives, but I knew what it was. So then I was able to play around with it. But if I don't have that anchor, then it would be a mess. Like the writer has to know everything, even if they don't put it in the book.
I appreciated that we didn't see the assaults, actually. We didn't need to. And I was grateful that you didn't feel you had to put them in there. I don't think the book would have been served by them. It was much stronger as it was put together.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour. I know, Lacey, you had some questions about the writing trade, but perhaps we'll save those for when you can both join us again at for Jillian's next book or
Right.
at the bookstore. But Jillian Medoff, Lacey Crawford, thank you so much for joining
Thank you
us
for
this
having
evening
us.
You.
at Home with
Terrific.
Literati. And you can buy the book. There's a link to purchase When We Were Bright and Beautiful in the chat. There's also a link in the description below if you're watching us on YouTube. And for those of you tuning in, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next event. Have a great evening, all. Take care.
Thank you,
Thank
Jillian.
you. Thank you so much, Lacey. Thank you.